Hello Com100 students. In this video, I want to discuss your Chapter 8 discussion forum, which focuses on planning, our first management function that we're taking a deep dive into. So we specifically in the lecture focused on certain tools and techniques that help us to plan for complex situations, such as forecasting, contingency planning, scenario planning, and benchmarking. And so your task in this discussion forum is to find a recent example of one of the following for your discussion. Now, in previous discussion forums, I've encouraged you either to use your own example, such as Chapter 5, where you reflected on your own experience, or an article, such as Chapter 3, where you could research something from a news outlet. For this particular forum, I want to encourage you to look at company-based examples. That is to say, I think that you are going to find much better or easier examples if you go and search for examples of companies that have done one of these planning techniques. That might mean that the information that you are summarizing comes from the company's website, or they've partnered with a company to help them forecast or do scenario planning or something along those lines, and it's a report or a summary of that endeavor. But I think you would be less likely to find a really good recounting of one of these planning tools simply on a news website. So I encourage you to look for company-based examples. Now, in your discussion, just to break it down before we look at the theory briefly, you should cite sources that you have read to familiarize yourself with these examples. In this case, it would probably be the company's website. And remember that you can use the one-stop referencing guide to just highlight how to go about referencing a website. I recommend a 200 to 250 word summary of your example for your readers. In terms of the theory, you're going to use the textbook, and you'll notice that I've included some additional points in this chapter discussion on Blackboard. Now, you're going to discuss and relate the theory points to the example. You're welcome to either praise or criticize your chosen example. You might even choose a combination based on the quality of the plan, objectives, and implementation, and perhaps additional relevant concepts that you've identified. That short little list is topics that you might notice from the Chapter 8 slides. So you might find, for example, that in the company you've identified, you are noticing they've done some things well, and you can praise them for that. You can give recognition, and other things they've done poorly, or it leaves something to be desired, and you're welcome to point that out. Something I want to mention is that you only have to choose one company and one of the planning techniques on this list. So if you choose forecasting, then that's the only planning technique you need to discuss for this piece of homework. You do not need to discuss all 4 of these planning techniques. This leaves us with a word count of 500 words. And what I want to mention in terms of just putting this together is that you're welcome to integrate your summary of the situation in the company with your theory discussion into one section. It's really about a preference that you may have for structuring it. So if you give your summary first and then discuss the theory, that's fine. If you choose to integrate them into one cohesive discussion, that is also fine. I am getting some emails about going over the word limit, and going over 10% is generally permissible, but I do want to encourage you to focus on summarizing the example well. You might even include a link to the company website in case your readers want to go look for more information. That should certainly be in your reference list if they have a URL. But I want to encourage you to focus on what's most important, because getting to the point in our writing and summarizing is a key skill that we're working on developing. Now, as you're making these connections between the theory and the example, remember a very good understanding of the theory is really key. Also remember that you have to respond to at least 2 posts of your peers. Let's take a quick look at the theory. Remember again that as you are reading the articles, your understanding of the theory is going to help you identify what has actually taken place in the company. They may not use exactly the same terminology that we are using in class or that you see in the textbook. Let's dive into our first option that you can discuss, forecasting. Now, this is essentially an attempt to predict the future. There are 2 types that we've discussed and that you'll find elaborations on in the textbook. Qualitative forecasting uses expert opinions. If we're dealing with a very complex situation where there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty, then using expert opinions to create plausible predictions of the future might be one of the only options available to help the company see, what they need to forecast for. In terms of quantitative forecasting, here we're probably in the realm of the more concrete, easier examples for you to find. These use mathematical models and involve a lot of statistical analysis. They often rely on historical data or survey data that has been gathered in order to analyze information. Any kind of sales forecast or forecast on building a new factory plant, launching a new kind of brand, anything like that is based on a forecast of whether the company believes this will sell well. You might hear words like feasibility studies connected to this, and all of that is relying on forecasting. Our next topic that we want to discuss is contingency planning. So here we're identifying different courses of action to take when things go wrong. As you may recall me mentioning in class, if you are involved in the aviation industry, then there are contingency plans for multiple things that could go wrong, so to speak, on a flight. What if there's a storm? What if a volcano erupts? What if birds fly into our flight path? Or someone tries to take over the plane in a terrorist act? There would be a contingency plan in place for each one of these scenarios. And what's really important is that we might have to combine a number of contingency plans to actually navigate what truly happens. So contingency plans help a company anticipate changing conditions. Often something's already happened in the past, so we have had situations of people trying to take over planes or birds flying into flight paths. And so the contingency plans are developed based on these potential scenarios, and the trigger points activate when a certain plan should come into play. It is a way of trying to navigate very uncertain futures, not because we know exactly what will happen or when it will happen, but because if it's happened before, chances are it will happen again, and we shouldn't be unprepared. So what contingency planning does a company have in place to deal with the future? Consider the COVID scenarios where companies, 18 months ago, lockdowns were not a thing that the world had ever gone through. But at this point, if they do not have some contingency planning in place with regards to social distancing requirements or potential lockdowns that may happen again in future, then that would be a contingency planning failure. Scenario planning. The shell videos that I've included for you in Chapter 8 really relate to this. This is actually a long-term version of contingency planning. So if you're trying to look for the degrees of separation, like what is the difference between contingency planning and scenario planning, contingency planning is something that is in place that we can act on right now, and we've got clarity on the steps we need to follow. Scenario planning helps us take a longer view into the future by identifying alternative future scenarios. And the idea here is that the company makes plans for each of these future scenarios. They might also use some forecasting means to try and identify how likely the underpinning elements are for each one of these future scenarios. The goal here is not that the company becomes really good at predicting the future, but rather that it helps them become or stay flexible and therefore able to adapt more easily to future shocks, such as diversifying the company's business or, as the saying goes, having your finger in more than one pie, which is the case with Shell going into green energy. Now, I don't mean to confuse you by linking scenario planning to both contingency planning and forecasting. The reality is that companies might be employing multiple techniques because, of course, they are facing complex conditions. You are not required to discuss all of them, and so in the example that you choose, make sure to zoom in on a very clear planning technique, such as scenario planning in this case. Lastly, we have benchmarking. This is quite different from the previous three approaches because here the company is aware of comparisons that they can make between departments in the company. This department is really excellent at their processes versus this one that has bad internal reviews, or that company has really excellent logistics, customer service, supply chain management, whatever the case might be. Let us go and compare ourselves to them to make improvements. Really, benchmarking is about adopting best practices. So here, what we're trying to do from a planning perspective is have better performance because we've identified what works, either internally in another department or externally at another business. We seek to go and identify the underpinning elements that make that successful and to replicate that in departments or company-wide to improve the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the company. So there are definitely planners involved in this. There are changes that need to happen in order to incorporate the suggestions, but these are the 4 planning approaches, and I encourage you to make sure that the example you pick, it's really clear in the company which one, and you can make very nice theory connections. On a last note, I just want to say that as you're making theory connections, they might relate to other aspects of this chapter and not only to benchmarking. So, for example, having too many goals or unclear goals or using the SMART goal principle could be something that you identify in your example. But clearly, we don't expect you to touch on everything in a 500-word discussion forum. So identify what fits, identify what's important, and make the theory connection.